So this was the slide that we ended last week on, where we started to look at the great scope of the lamrim with the idea of bodhicitta. Um, were there any questions from last week before we progress? Okay, so this idea of bodhicitta, it it's an evolution of the motivation of the practitioner. So in the earlier classes, we said that everything that Buddha taught was really intended to be appropriate for a single individual at different points in time. So when the spiritual seeker, spiritual aspirant, um, doesn't really know anything, hasn't really started at all, then the Buddha provided contemplations that would help that person to, at a minimum, close the door to the worst kinds of sufferings that they might experience, to get them motivated to understand those sufferings and then to turn away from creating the cause of those sufferings. And those practitioners are engaging at that level on the initial scope or the small scope. And then in the middle scope, that practitioner is also meant to realize that, good future rebirths, higher rebirths, have limited value, that there is value in um, avoiding the lower realms, the worst kinds of overt sufferings, um, but that even in the upper realms, there is still suffering. And ultimately, over very long periods of time, it's not really sustainable, to say that, you wouldn't have pretty negative experiences, pretty intensely suffering experiences given enough time. You would, because you're still under the influence of karma and affliction, that, you can create the causes for a succession of human lifetimes, but over very long time scales, it starts to become questionable what exactly is going to end up happening. So you develop a weariness about participating in cyclic existence as a whole. You develop what we called renunciation or definite emergence, the wish to definitely emerge from suffering. And you become focused, if you are staying in in the middle scope rather, you would become focused on individual liberation, or lower nirvana, individual liberation. But now we're looking at this third type of motivation where the practitioner understands that their own individual liberation is not sufficient, because yes, you can accomplish that if you really put your mind to it. You can create those causes and those conditions and bring about the end of suffering for oneself, but that doesn't help any of the other sentient beings who continue to experience suffering within cyclic existence. So now we are looking at that motivation, the motivation of a great scope practitioner who wants to do something about the suffering of all sentient beings. So that is, yeah.
With the middle scope, when somebody achieves nirvana for themselves, does this eventually wear out, because they are not trying to help others?
No, it isn't something that by itself you can fall back from. So there are many kinds of, like we said, with if you just create positive karma that um, would lead you to human rebirths, for example, or even rebirths in the god or demigod or formless realms or what have you. Um, those are all temporary states. Those are all, compared to the lower realms, they're much better, but they're all temporary. Um, but when you achieve individual liberation or nirvana, that doesn't have an end through, in and of its own power. Um, there is a teaching within the Mahayana tradition that would suggest that those who achieve full enlightenment, um, their consciousness, just like we discussed how the consciousness of a fully enlightened being can reach the beings in the human realm, the animal realm, all of these kind of ordinary realms, they can also reach these beings who are absorbed in their experience of nirvana. And they can kind of encourage those beings because they're not really people, because a person is having a particular range of karmic experiences, and this is sort of a nirvanic being um, who's only experiencing absorption into the nirvanic experience. But fully enlightened beings are said to be able to interact with these beings and try to encourage them to go even further, um, to actually fully, perfect their minds and achieve full enlightenment, um, to sort of rouse them from that state of absorption in that they are in. Um, and if that happens, then then they can sort of intentionally take human form, or maybe a form in a pure land, or whatever forms might be um, beneficial for their continued training, and then they can get to the point where they have completed that training, that full additional training, and then now they are enlightened beings. um, but if you know the state itself isn't something that can dissipate or just sort of fall back from, nor can you from the state of full enlightenment. Those are both what are called true cessations that the Buddha taught. So they you can no longer experience suffering in either of those conditions.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so this practitioner on the great scope is recognizing that their own liberation doesn't benefit others, and wants to, is moved to be of benefit to others, and therefore begins to train in developing bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is the wish to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. Um, and before that practitioner directly works on achieving bodhicitta, there are two meditations that are taught that give rise to bodhicitta in the mind of the practitioner. But the prerequisite to that training is equanimity, because we said that uh, bodhicitta is the wish to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. So we can't leave any sentient beings out of that motivation. Um, and that isn't something that we find is easy, for us. Even, of course, for us, we may not even really be a practitioner of the small scope. We probably aren't a practitioner of the middle scope. But still, even if a practitioner is reaching that level, they are still dealing with partiality. They're still dealing with this tendency in the mind to find it easy to work for the benefit of those that that person, that we can say we or they, um, we're dealing with this too. Um, People find it easier to work for the benefit of those who we feel benefited by. Um, we find it more difficult to work for the benefit of people who haven't really helped or hurt us in any way, just kind of random people on the street. And we find it particularly challenging to try to work for the benefit of those who we feel like are opposed to our interests, who are working against us, or who we feel like have harmed us in some way, who have wronged us in some way, or harmed or wronged people that we care about or that we feel close to. Um, so in one way of talking, those categorizations are friends, enemies, and strangers. Enemies is a bit of a strong phrase, but people that trigger aversion in our minds because we feel like they've done something harmful, either again to ourselves directly or to people that we care about. Um, and that doesn't having that partial mind, that partial attitude is a real obstacle to this highest level of spiritual development. Um, because we can't exclude even those harmers, those enemies, those people that we feel like are engaged in really terrible actions against us, against others. We can't say, well, I want to achieve enlightenment in order to benefit everyone but those people. Um, so we have to develop equanimity. We have to sort of have equal regard for all of these different kinds of sentient beings and bring everybody up. It's not about like bringing some people down and like not, but it's about bringing everybody up to being cherished, everybody up to the same level of caring, genuinely, naturally, spontaneously being interested in their welfare, working for their welfare, and not holding back our interest because we think, well, they don't deserve it. They haven't earned my love, my compassion because of their actions. That attitude is really harmful for this level of development. So we have to overcome that by training in equanimity. And basically, we do that by recognizing that, over a variety of lifetimes, every individual sentient being is playing different roles. And even within a single lifetime, we see that, if someone says nice things, if they speak pleasantly, if they have similar interests, if they show support, then we very quickly become interested in benefiting them. If they stop doing that, if they start speaking harshly, if they adopt views that we think, are negative or harmful, then we very quickly, cool toward them and we lose interest. Um, so we see how kind of surface level this process of categorization is, because the people that are our closest friends, in past lives, they were our worst enemies. And even in this life, we can have that happen. We can have our closest friend become our worst enemy. And then we can make up and everything is fine. And now they're our best friend again. So we see how kind of crazy the mind is in how easily it is swayed in going back and forth, and reserving or extending love and compassion. So we try to relate to people on a really deep level rather than this surface level that doesn't make any sense. And of course, actually accomplishing that training is difficult. We have to overcome, a lot of deep-seated tendencies, but that's kind of the general way in which you would go about it, you would really see through that surface level way of categorizing and try to relate to people on that deep level. Um, yeah, any thoughts or questions so far? So, assuming that we do that, of course, which would take a lot of time, a lot of dedicated effort, but assuming that we can have this equanimous mind that is embracing all sentient beings within the field of our love and compassion, um, then now we're kind of ready to actually work on developing the meditative realization of bodhicitta. And the first tradition, the first technique that we use is called the six causes and one effect, or seven different names, six causes and one effect, or 7-point cause and effect meditation, has different translations, but there are, as it says here, there are six causes that lead to the effect of bodhicitta. Okay, so the first step in this process is to recognize that all sentient beings have played the role of one's mother. And this is kind of understood to be just sort of a mathematical certainty. This is, the understanding here is that that the total number of existent sentient beings is fewer, although it's nearly limitless, nearly infinite. The number of past lives that we've had is truly infinite. And so every single sentient being has had opportunities to play the role of one's own mother numerous times over these beginningless past lives. So this is true of one's mother in this life, one's father in this life, every bug and animal and insect, every single sentient being has incarnated beginningless times in the relationship of literally the mother or the father, the caregiver, toward the incarnation that we were taking at that time. Um, so that, and again, that's just sort of presented as something that's logically true, mathematically true. Um, but we have to kind of think through that and get to the point where we um, think, oh, this sentient being in front of me has been my mother countless times. And if that spontaneously arises whenever any sentient being is in front of us, then we've really, deeply recognized that that's true. And then we recognize the kindness that is shown to us in all of those past lives where we think about what is the sort of typical kindness of the mother, of carrying us in the womb, feeding us from her body, protecting us, giving us food, giving us shelter, educating us, even being willing to undergo hardships or difficulties, maybe sometimes laying down her own life to protect our life. So we think about all of these kinds of kindnesses that are sort of baked into that dynamic. And we now are extending that to all sentient beings, thinking it isn't just the mother in this life that's related to me that way. Every single sentient being that exists has related to me through that kind of lens of kindness. Um, so again and again, we're sort of combining the first two. Every single sentient being has been our mother, and based on that, they've shown us all of these kinds of kindnesses each and every time that they played that role. And then what they say is that if we do those two steps well, the wish to repay that kindness will naturally and spontaneously kind of arise in the mind. We don't have to really do anything. Um, it's like when you think about, you know, anyone's kindness, if you think about, the kindness of just people, anyone in this life, and if you really sit there and you really think about it, then you're like, oh, I really should do something to benefit them. I really should repay what they've given me. Um, so then step 4 is we generate sort of a warm-hearted, affectionate love for all of these. So, on the basis of that, seeing all sentient beings as having been one's mother, understanding their kindness, really thinking that I should do something to repay that kindness. Now we're kind of softening our hearts and opening our hearts toward all sentient beings, and we're thinking of them in this really warm-hearted, open-hearted way and wishing for their happiness. Um, and then step 5 is generating compassion. So we also have to recognize and think about the ways in which these kind mother sentient beings experience suffering again and again and again. All of the ways in which they meet with difficulties, with obstacles, with challenges, with various sufferings of all of the different realms of existence. And we try to generate this attitude in our own mind that it's unbearable, that these kind mother sentient beings are experiencing all of these hardships again and again and again because they are simply participating in cyclic existence. They are simply taking ordinary rebirth after ordinary rebirth due to the force of karma and delusion. And so necessarily, unavoidably, they will meet with suffering, and they will continue to meet with suffering. And some of that suffering is really quite intense. And so we really try to develop strong compassion, thinking that it's absolutely unacceptable. It is unbearable, that I can't wait for even a second to try to alleviate the suffering of these kind mother sentient beings. And then step 6 is we generate here what's called the uncommon attitude of universal responsibility. So we've gone through the previous steps where we've arrived at this feeling that sentient beings, kind mother sentient beings, are in this really difficult sort of existential condition and how unbearable that is. And so we're kind of faced with a choice like, well, we could think, oh, I wish somebody else would do something. I wish somebody else would come along, and wouldn't it be great if somebody else did something about this? But that's not really what we're going here, for here. We really want to adopt responsibility. We want to think that I myself will do something about this. I myself will protect all kind mother sentient beings from suffering, even by myself alone. I will take uh, responsibility for all sentient beings, and through my own efforts, even by myself alone, I will bring all sentient beings into the state of full enlightenment, where they are not subject to any of these sufferings, where they can experience perfect bliss and happiness and contentment, um, free from all of those fears, all of those dangers. Um, and then this leads to, so these are the 6 steps, and then it leads to then bodhicitta, the 7th, the cause, the effect. Those are the 6 causes, and it leads to the effect of bodhicitta because once we get to this step, the 6th step, we have identified that we want to do something. We've identified that we need to do something, and we've taken responsibility for doing it. And we've even gone so far as to recognize that the only thing that we can do is to bring sentient beings to enlightenment. But we also now have to recognize that we aren't capable of that in our present form, in our present state. Um, we haven't even closed the door to the lower realms completely, necessarily. We haven't even, um, because a person can train, of course, a person can engage in these meditations without actually perfecting the earlier stages. Um, there's some understanding or some acknowledgement that really being successful in the great scope does depend on being successful on the middle scope and does depend on being successful on the small scope. But for us as practitioners, we can certainly engage in all of these meditations and familiarize our mind with it. But even if a person has perfected the small scope and perfected the middle scope, and truly they all they have left to do is the great scope, they are not enlightened. They are not a Buddha. They're closer to it than we are, but they're still not fully enlightened. And so the idea that they can bring all sentient beings to enlightenment is kind of silly, in the sense that they lack that capacity. We certainly lack it, but even they would lack it. Even someone who's developed their mind to a much higher degree would still, because they themselves are not enlightened, they cannot bring any other sentient being to enlightenment. So, in order to actually do what we are saying that we want to do, the only choice is for ourselves to become enlightened. And then we possess the ability to enlighten others, to bring all others to enlightenment. But before that, we're of pretty limited benefit to sentient beings. We should be of benefit in whatever way we can, but that particular benefit is not really something that we can accomplish for sentient beings. So, on the basis of taking responsibility for sentient beings, now we have to do whatever is necessary for ourselves to achieve the state of enlightenment so that we become able to make good on our own promise to sentient beings to bring them to enlightenment. So that's the first of two major meditative methods or traditions that generate the mind of bodhicitta in the practitioner, in the mind of the practitioner. Are there any thoughts or questions about the first, the 6 point, six cause and one effect, or 7 point cause and effect meditation?
I don't know if it really relates directly to the six causes and one effect, but I have this question about in many texts and teachings, particularly when I just recently studied that was a gathering of advanced spiritual beings. It mentioned specifically monks, but not nuns. And I wanted to know how Buddhism deals with the modern notions of women's equality with some of the older notions and practices that seem to limit women in their role in
Yeah, I
spiritual.
mean, it's certainly true that, Asian culture in general seems fairly patriarchal, in general. And um, but I don't really think that you see that's sort of I think just a human failing, a human limitation culturally. Um, and I mean, you're right that it has bled over into the kinds of systems that have been erected over the last, because most of those systems are dependent on unenlightened beings kind of helping to create them. Um, I mean, in the actual teachings of the Buddha, I don't think that you see those kinds of problematic views, um, but they do exist in culture, and that, that's certainly fair. Um, the Buddha is very clear, I think, in his teachings that there's no um, relationship between, there's there's a recognition that, the time and the space that is afforded to a person by having the kind of simplistic lifestyle, of monks and nuns, historically speaking, that there's benefit to having time and space and so on, as compared to a lot of obligations and busyness and that sort of thing. So, there's an appreciation of that. Um, but also, particularly with Vajrayana and so on, it's very clear that anyone, even someone who has a lot of obligations and there's pluses and minuses to both, um, because you learn certain by having husbands and wives and children and careers, you you also are presented with opportunities to engage in certain kinds of practice that wouldn't be there without those sorts of opportunities. But then also, you have to maybe try to find some time to do retreat and things, so there's sort of that. But in terms of gender, I really think that's just sort of a cultural thing that unfortunately is still, present in the world. But I don't think that you don't really find it, being espoused by the great masters, His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, and so on. I mean, the Buddha, ordaining women at the time, which is, what the Buddha did during his lifetime, was a really radical thing that really had no corollary in Indian society at the time. Um, he was recognizing, that there's no difference between men and women in terms of um, their. Now, again, subsequent to that, it's certainly true that um, oftentimes that the role of nuns was to be sort of help for the monks, um, and I do think that that's changing, but I just really think it's a cultural thing, and I don't think that it's something that is being actively, you know, um, continued, in the present day.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Okay, so the second method is called equalizing and exchanging self for other. So I said that there's these two methods for developing bodhicitta. The first method, as we saw, it's kind of transactional in a way, the first method, because you are thinking of all sentient beings as having been your mother, you're thinking of their kindness, you're developing the wish to repay that kindness, so it's kind of like, well, y- all sentient beings have benefited me, and so I should benefit all sentient beings. So in a way, it's tapping into a natural kind of transactional drive that we have, that we've sort of that's sort of part of society, part of how people are expected to think and behave. And the second method is deeper than that. It doesn't rely on that kind of transactional model. This phrase, equalizing self for other, kind of what it means at what it's getting at is equalizing um, and exchanging self-cherishing for other cherishing. So with this, we are focused on the fact that what we're kind of directly going toward um, a different kind of equalizing where at first we equalized um, our relationship to beings. And here we're equalizing, thinking like, well, I shouldn't only work for the benefit of those who have benefited me. I shouldn't only work for the benefit of those who, um, you know, I feel kind of warmly toward. I should work for the benefit of all sentient beings. But with that, we leave intact this idea that still I'm number one, that like I come first. And then when I'm working for the benefit of others, or to the extent that I'm interested or engaged in benefiting others, then I'm kind of going to do that on an equal basis. But still, I'm not touching my self-cherishing. I'm not touching the fact that I come before all other sentient beings. Maybe they're all equal, but they're not really equal to me. Here we are equalizing the actual degree of cherishing, and we're saying that I'm going to train in actually cherishing all other sentient beings more than myself. Um, and it's not like a self-effacing kind of, idea. It isn't, oh, I'm terrible and sentient beings are amazing, and so I'm worthless and I just care about other. It's understanding that um, when we cherish other sentient beings, we actually accomplish our own highest welfare as a side effect of that. It's not actually that we are left in the dust when we cherish others. By cherishing others, our own highest spiritual goals are accomplished as a side effect, as a consequence of cherishing others. So it's actually a really brave attitude, that isn't like putting ourselves down, but it's getting at why, is it reasonable to only care about myself? Is it reasonable to look after myself first when sentient beings are numberless, when sentient beings, and why do I feel like I have a greater claim to happiness as compared to any other sentient being? We are all equal in wanting happiness and wanting to be free of suffering, and I can't really claim any greater um, ability or being more deserving of reaching that goal as compared to any other sentient being. So we should all work together and we should all arrive at that goal of enlightenment together. Um, and we do that by really putting others, at the forefront of our interests. Uh, Okay. So so this one is considered to be a more difficult meditation because um, that more transactional model is kind of patterned after how we are sort of normally navigating our relationships. Um, Basically, all we're doing is developing the attitude that it isn't only that a certain subset of sentient beings have benefited me, so I only care about a certain subset of sentient beings. We're basically developing the attitude that every single sentient being has benefited me, so I owe that to every single sentient being equally. Um, Whereas this is really striking at the heart of our priorities and, our inclination our natural inclination to put ourselves first and put others second. Um, so, yeah, so they say, and we can certainly work with both of these and, kind of see which one. But they say that for a lot of people, it's easier to actually realize bodhicitta, using that kind of more transactional model. The first one is, generally easier. Okay. Any thoughts or questions? Yep.
Did you just say that the first one, the mother sentient being one, is easier than the equalizing and exchanging self and others?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
Generally,
okay.
it's because it relies on that sort of transactional approach, and it doesn't we which is sort of more it's tapping into like, oh, all sentient beings have given me a gift, so I should give them a gift. It's kind of it's a comfortable way of thinking in a way, something that we're familiar with already. Any other questions? Okay, so if we assume then that we've used one of these methods and we've generated bodhicitta in our minds, now we are a person who has done that is now a bodhisattva, someone who has generated bodhicitta in their mind. And then what they do, kind of the job of a bodhisattva, is to engage in what are called the six perfections. And we don't really can't really go into any significant detail. This is something that Geshe Dondrub is teaching. Unfortunately, he's also not teaching on it for a long time, but he taught on it last week and this Sunday and next Sunday. The six perfections: generosity, ethics or morality, patience, joyous effort, concentration, and wisdom. Um, so, and yeah, so this is what a bodhisattva, what they focus on. They focus on training, actually, and of course, these are all important things that we should be focused on too. We should be focused on being generous, on being ethical, on being patient, engaging in joyous effort is sort of delighting in virtue, not feeling that virtue is like a chore, not something that we have to do, but really having a sort of taking joy and delight in engaging in our spiritual path. And even when we meet with obstacles on the path, kind of, having perseverance and really just tackling those. And then concentration is meditative concentration. And then wisdom is particularly wisdom that realizes the nature of reality. Um, but this is kind of the job description of a bodhisattva, is someone who is actually not just engaging in these trainings, but perfecting these trainings, really. That this is the bodhisattva vehicle. This is by um, engaging in these trainings and really perfecting these trainings, they're purifying their minds, more and more, and overcoming afflictions more and more by dedicating themselves to these particular trainings. But again, it isn't like it suddenly becomes important um, only when you've achieved, um, you know, being a bodhisattva. These are, of course, important for us even right now to be, to the extent that we can, to be generous, to be ethical, to have patience, to have joyous effort, to make strides in our meditation, to develop concentration, and to grow our wisdom. And then another way that you can talk about what a bodhisattva is doing is they are progressing through the five paths, the path of accumulation, preparation, seeing, meditation, and no more learning. These are English translations of Tibetan words. Sorry, let me fix this. So, Yeah, so these are like technical words that are referring to paths of training in the mental continuum of a bodhisattva. So when we say accumulation, at that time in the bodhisattva spiritual growth, they're focusing on engaging in a lot of meritorious efforts. They are accumulating the karmic causes of achieving enlightenment by benefiting sentient beings, doing all kinds of activities that are creating the conditions, the inner conditions. Um, and then on the path of preparation, they will have a correct inferential understanding of the nature of reality through meditating on emptiness or the nature of reality. So they begin with accumulating, and then once they've accumulated, enough stores of virtue and merit, then on the second path, they um, focus now more so on just meditating on the nature of reality. And by engaging in that path, there comes a point where they will have what's called a correct inferential understanding of the nature of reality. And then they continue to do that. They continue to refine their meditation on the nature of reality. And then on the path of seeing, they see emptiness or the nature of reality. They see it directly for the first time without the use of concepts, without the use of any kind of conceptual mediation. They have a direct experience of the nature of reality that's not mediated through any kind of conceptual mind. Um, and then now they have done that. Now they are an Arya being at this. They're an Arya Bodhisattva. So you can be an Arya. We've talked about in the first class, we talked about how an Arya is someone who's seen the nature of reality directly. You can do that on the Theravadan path, the path that leads to individual enlightenment, or you can do that on the Bodhisattva path. If and when you do that on the Bodhisattva path, you are then an Arya Bodhisattva. You were a Bodhisattva, then you saw emptiness directly, and now you're an Arya Bodhisattva. Once you've seen emptiness directly on the Bodhisattva path, on the Bodhisattva, paths here, you just continue to steep your mind in that understanding, in that realization. Unfortunately, it doesn't just kind of immediately happen. It doesn't just, you don't just instantly achieve enlightenment. You have to repeat that experience on the path of meditation, which again, sounds like a strange word because of course you've been meditating all along. We should be meditating in order to, and we're nowhere near any of this. But when they say the path of meditation, given that it comes after the path of seeing, really what they're saying is you've had this direct non-conceptual realization of emptiness, and now you're just repeating that experience again and again and again. And at some point, by engaging in that, you enter the path of no more learning, which again, these are technical transliterations of Tibetan words. But the path of no more learning means that now on that path, you do achieve the state of enlightenment. So the state of enlightenment isn't anything other than a direct realization of emptiness arising in the mind of a bodhisattva, but they have to generate that mind, until it gets rid of each time that they meditate on emptiness directly, it's purifying their mind. It's, removing afflictions from their mind. The strength of that familiarity, of that insight is growing. And then that process naturally, just by its repetition, leads to full enlightenment by itself. It's just that, it's kind of like if you start with, a really muddy piece of cloth, and you know that soap and water is the solution to that. Um, but still, you dunk the really muddy cloth in the soap and water once, and you still have a muddy cloth. It didn't, you got rid of some of that dirt, but you have to do it over and over and over until the cloth is just completely pristine, completely cleansed of all stain. So the antidote, the process is the same. It's just that the mind doesn't instantly transform. The mind takes time to get to that point. Um, any thoughts or questions about the 5 paths? Okay. So then the next verse in Lama Tsongkhapa's Foundation of All Good Qualities is here. And so once I have pacified distraction to wrong objects and correctly realized the meaning of reality, please bless me to generate within my mind stream the unified path of calm abiding and special insight. So here, this is talking about what we are talking about here. This where the Arya Bodhisattva is on this training within these 5 paths. This is sort of elaborating on this process of the 5 paths, where we have to develop calm abiding and special insight. Once we have had a correct inferential understanding of the nature of reality, we have to develop the ability to see emptiness directly. And the only way that we can do that is to develop what's called fully qualified calm abiding, which is an ability to meditate without distraction for as long as we might wish, without any change in the vibrancy or the clarity of the object that we're meditating on. So we know for us, when we try to meditate, there's all kinds of distractions that arise in the mind. The mind is dull, or the mind is overly excited. The object, when the object does appear, it disappears very quickly. Uh, Fully qualified calm abiding is just a level of meditative skill that we can develop. There are 9. We're not going to go into the 9 levels. There in Tibetan Buddhism, they've just sort of arbitrarily put together a way of thinking about that, where you have these 9 stages, and each stage is characterized by a certain level of meditative skill. But you could invent a new, you could say, well, no, there's really 12 levels. If you had 12, then you'd have smaller gradations between the different levels. They'd just use 9 as a way of talking about how a person gets better at meditating, at getting better at um, causing the object of meditation to be present in the mind without any reduction in its vibrancy or its clarity. For us, that's certainly not our experience, but it is possible to develop fully qualified calm abiding, which comes with they talk about mental and physical bliss and pliancy. So the mind and the body become very light, very blissful, very kind of pliable. And that meditator can enter meditation effortlessly, remain in meditation for days or even weeks. And the object of their meditation appears to their mind without any reduction in vibrancy or clarity over whatever time that they might wish to stay absorbed in that object. And you do actually have to develop the ninth level of calm abiding in order to see emptiness directly. You don't have to have it to have a correct inferential realization of emptiness, but to refine a correct inferential understanding into a direct, non conceptual understanding, your mind has to, you have to have the kind of mind of a meditator of the skill of the ninth level of calm abiding. Otherwise, you will never succeed. You will never get to a direct, non conceptual realization. And that is required to achieve full enlightenment. Um, or even to be an Arya. So it is a necessary step in the path, this idea of fully qualified calm abiding. Yeah.
So I've heard about this before, about the calm abiding and all of this, and I've been working on a calm abiding meditation for a little bit over a year, and um, I still haven't like really completely got it. And my question for you is it possible that someone just like won't get it, or is it just that difficult that um it can just take a really long time? Because I just can't really quite get it. Like I won't be able to find my breath or whatever. Like I'm just not
Hmm.
catching on. And then sometimes like I'll get it and it'll be like so profound, but I can't like get back to it like at all. And I don't know what led to me getting it that I can replicate it and get back to that spot. So it's just like
Yeah.
it feels like I have no control over it. So I feel like I'm just not getting it. So my question is it possible that somebody just wouldn't get it? Or how long should this take? So that's my question.
Yeah. So the next slide is kind of going to address to some degree kind of those sorts of issues, and then I'll maybe go into a little bit more detail. So it is understood. So as I mentioned, that there are these 9 levels of calm abiding, right? So um, if a person is in daily, just sort of living in their daily lives, um, and they just sort of have a meditation practice of, whatever it is, half an hour a day, an hour a day, whatever it might be. But they also like they're going to work and, they are going to the grocery store and so on. Um, it it's understood in the teachings that the actual ninth level of calm abiding can only be accomplished in strict retreat, um, meaning that you go off. You can, and I don't know. I don't think that there's any way of saying what level, what like the third level or the fifth level, that a person could expect to accomplish within sort of the busyness of their daily lives. Um, but it's something like that. It's something like the fifth level or, what have you. It's something that's kind of where a person would peak if they were only trying to do it within a normal kind of busy life. So it's understood that going on strict retreat is necessary to actually get the ninth level. And so these conducive factors um, are kind of part of this retreat understanding. So the foundation of calm abiding, of meditative progress, is ethical restraint. So, and we touched on this before. Um, if a person is, killing and stealing and lying and doing all of these terrible things, or even just kind of like being generally deceptive, manipulative, etc., that's going to be an obstacle to fully qualified calm abiding. So that's a big reason why the Buddha, taught the ethical restraint, the teachings on ethics, is because we have to subdue our minds in that way as a foundation for calm abiding. And then, as it says, we do have to go off and be, kind of in a secluded place. Um, and yeah, and then proper diet is considered to be helpful. They say, you don't want to eat too much at any one time. You want to eat mostly toward the vegetarian, side of things. Um, Even, some meditators will have a big, relatively larger breakfast, and then, a good sized, lunch, and then maybe if they eat dinner, something quite small. So because then the idea is that early morning is a really good time to meditate. And if we have a really heavy dinner, then kind of every early morning for us, the body is going to sort of be processing, that food, and it's going to, that the energies of the body are going to kind of be absorbed in processing our food. So we would kind of want our last meal to be the lightest, at least, kind of generally the lightest of the day. Um, and then, you don't want to, you want to think about, am I not getting enough sleep? Am I chronically tired, etc.? And then the proper posture. Um, you know, there's the Vajrayana posture where, which is the ideal posture. But basically, you want to think about trying to train your body to sit in a really comfortable, really stable position, because that is helpful at these deeper levels of meditative absorption. There's a relaxation response that's triggered in the body. And if we train ourselves to have a stable posture, then that response can happen, and we will sort of still be self-contained in our posture. Um, Now, in terms of your question, like, is it possible that some people, just no matter what, can't achieve fully qualified calm abiding? I don't know the answer to that definitively. I mean, I would say certainly it's, if a person um, had damage, probably there's some people maybe with, certain kinds of conditions, mental conditions, physical damage to parts of the brain that are, necessary, because the mind is mediated through the brain. It's different from the brain, but physical damage, plays a role in how the mind is expressed. So, but beyond that, in terms of like generally, I don't think it's off limits generally. Um, and how long the um, the retreat, they say it can take, um, you know, it can take a couple of years, even in strict retreat. So it's a difficult process. In the teachings, that they would say 6 months is kind of the minimum. Um, but a lot of people would say that for us, we're so habituated to distraction that 6 months is really overly optimistic. So um, it does, I would say generally the idea is that a person will find that, maybe even I would say probably 1 year probably isn't enough time to 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 be confident that a person has reached like as far as they can in daily life. But at some point they would reach that, and then they would go into retreat, and then they would kind of finish and get to the ninth level, after they've kind of feel like they've gone as far as they can outside of retreat.
Can can somebody go into retreat even if they're at a point like I am where they're such a beginner that they're not even really getting it? Is someone prepared to go on a retreat like that, or is it not even ready for retreat? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, when you say when the idea of retreat is like 6 or 8 hours of meditation a day,
Okay.
7 days a week. So if that is something that would, feel impossible, then probably, you kind of have to work up to the point where that seems realistic, where that seems like you could do that.
Maybe 4 hours, maybe. I could do a partial retreat, maybe. So, okay. Thank you very much.
Any other thoughts or questions?
I was reading somewhere that it was like a 2-year process to achieve calm abiding. I thought I saw something at I don't know if it was at Kopan Monastery or Tushita where they had like a special 2-year kind of course or something.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Um, yeah, I don't. I mean, I would say that 2 years of strict retreat. It might not be unreasonable to think that a person could do it in that length of time. Um, okay. Any other? All right. So now we are going into the last topic. Finally, this idea of what is the nature of reality? What does it mean to see the nature of reality, to see emptiness either through a correct inferential understanding or ultimately to see it directly? So this first slide is looking at kind of these two sides of reality. On the left side, we have sort of conventional reality or the world of appearances, the world of the way that things just sort of in a natural kind of reflexive way, the way that things appear to the mind. And then you have the way that things actually are, their emptiness. So these are two sides of how, two sides of reality, their appearance and then their ultimate, you could say their ultimate nature. Um, so sorry, I clicked the So, sorry. So the second slide is ultimate reality, and the first slide is the world of appearance. So these two together characterize reality. We have conventional reality or the world of appearance, and then we have ultimate reality. Um, so the world of appearance is a world that um, this is how, for us as ordinary beings, when we just look at the world, this is how the world seems. This is how objects, meaning anything that appears to the mind, how it appears to the mind. It appears to the mind for an untrained, ordinary person when they are just engaging with the world. Everything that appears to that person appears as though it inherently exists, meaning that it appears from the side of the object. It is as though everything that is out there in the world has its own nature, its own essence, its own kind of identity, its own findable, pointable sort of intrinsic reality, as though it's things are set up from their own side. They are self-supporting. And so the idea here is that when we look at the world, we kind of think that it has nothing to do with us, that we are just passively noticing this is a cup, this is a uh, lamp, this is a glass, and it's out there in the world, and I'm an observer, and I'm just becoming aware of what's truly out there, independent of me, these things that have their own identity, their own self-supporting existence that I am completely separate from, and all I'm doing is becoming aware of what is out there. That's how things appear. But the Buddha says that this world of appearance is deceptive, that things don't actually exist in the way that they appear. They do exist. It isn't that everything is a total fabrication, but the way in which they exist is different than the way in which they appear. Um, so the ultimate reality of any of these things that we are aware of is that they are not inherently existent entities. They are what are called dependent arisings. Um, they arise dependently on these three things, on causes and conditions, on their parts, and on an act of mental imputation or an act of mental labeling. So the world of appearance arises independent upon those three things. Any thoughts, or am I losing anyone? Yep.
I don't get the parts part of it.
So yeah, so we'll go through that. So this idea of ultimate reality is looking at a way of analyzing the world of appearance. So we can take any example of the world of appearance. For example, like a car is a common example that people use. So when we look at a car outside, we just think, oh, yes, that is a car. It is not a flower. It is not a dog. It is not the road. It is not a building. It is a car. And that car is just hanging out there, and it is broadcasting to me that it is a car. And I'm just observing this is car, and this is flower next to the car, or this is tree next to the car. And the problem is that the Buddha says the problem is that we don't take any responsibility for creating this idea of car that's appearing to the mind. We think that that just is a car and it's just there, and I'm just observing that it is there. And if I leave, then the car is just not there anymore, or we say that the car drove away, whatever. And the Buddha says that actually cognition is a very, very active process, and that arrive at this idea of car in an active way that we are participating in a very critical and deep way. So the idea of the emptiness of the car, or the ultimate nature of the car, is a way of analyzing, yes, there is something there. We're not saying that like we're all participating in some kind of video game, simulation, or there is something that is, material in its nature. But the first way that we can recognize that this car is being actively created is to say that it arose, or it depends on causes and conditions. So we would say, well, the car has steel in it, it has rubber, it has electronic components, it has some fabric, it has some leather or cotton or all of these different all of these different things. And, so in one way of analyzing the car, we would say, well, none of those things always existed as in the way in which they are existing now. The cotton used to be in a field somewhere. It was picked and then it was processed and then it was dyed and it was woven together. The plastic was some chemicals that were heated and, mixed together and laid out and pressed and, whatever, all of these things. And then the steel is a combination of different metals, and those used to be part of rocks that were in the ground. Um, and so every aspect of the car can be traced back to other things. And then even that cotton, what does that cotton depend on? Well, it depended on the rain, it depended on, good weather, it depended on, nitrogen in the soil, sunlight, etc. And so you have all of these incredible kind of individual histories of all of these different aspects of what is now something that we are thinking about as a car. But our perception of that car is if it was just sort of fully formed right there in the moment and almost like it's always been a car, that it just sort of is car. But it had to be assembled, it had to be put together. And when did it become a car? When, in the factory, at what point did it go from not being car to being car? And when we think of like a tree, even a tree, something completely natural, that tree used to be a much smaller tree, and then it used to be a sapling, and then it used to be a seed. And what is, why is its current form as a very large tree, why is that any more valid or different than the seed? It's just the same thing at two different points in time. Just like an old person and a fetus is the same thing at two different points. And we would say that the causes and the conditions of the old person is the fetus. And then, of course, the fetus. What does the fetus depend upon? Well, it depends upon the right conditions in the womb, the lack of trauma, access to food, and, all of these sorts of causes and conditions. So what we're observing at any point in time is sort of like a frozen moment of the coming together of lots of causes and conditions. But they have all had their past histories. And we never really take those into consideration. We just look at this frozen moment and we think that that frozen moment is something individual and unique. And then to your question, the parts, when we look at the parts of any given object, it's going to have a front and a back and a top and a bottom and an inside and an outside. And so with a car, you've got the right passenger front door, you've got the left passenger front door, the right passenger seat, the left passenger seat, the steering wheel, the engine, the carburetor, the tail lights, the headlights, the roof, thousands of different parts, right? And if you take away just like one door handle, do you still have a car? If you just remove, let's say you had four door handles and you take one of them away, everything else is the same. Is it still a car? What if you take away all four door handles? What if you take away all of the windows or all of the windows and the windshield? Um, at what point does this coming together of parts constitute what we think of as car versus before then it wasn't car? It's a really the idea is to see that it's arbitrary, that it's that there's nothing really valid about this idea of car because it is only coming together on the basis of causes and conditions and parts. And then this active mental imputation or active mental labeling, where we say, well, it performs this kind of function. And so we're going to just all agree that, you know, you get into it, you turn it on, and you can go somewhere, and then you can get out of it, and now you're in a different place. And you did that, you know, vis-a-vis a combustion engine or an electric engine, but not a jet engine, not by, you know, foot power, not by, you know, because that would be a bicycle, right? It's the same, it's a conveyance, but if it's foot powered and it has two wheels and you sit in it and there are no windows and, you know, then it's a bicycle. Um, and so we distinguish bicycles from cars in dependence upon the existence of an electrical engine or a combustion engine and multiple seats, windows, doors, etc. Even though in both cases they take you somewhere, but they do it differently. And so we give them different names, and they have different causes and conditions, and they have different parts. But at some point, people got together and they say, okay, this performs this function. And so everything that performs this function is going to be called whatever it is in this language, in a different language, some other thing. If it flies in the sky, then it's an airplane. If it flies in the sky, but it has, you know, a rotor, then it's a helicopter, um, you know, etc. And it's just based on what is its function, exactly what do you do with it. You know, if you can eat it, then it's food. If you can't eat it, then it's not food. Um, you know, etc. If you can drink it, then it's a beverage. If you can't, if by drinking it you would die, it's not a beverage. We wouldn't call it a beverage. So we make up culturally, societally, we make up these distinctions based on how things function, what they do, and then once we've given the label to the object, now it is as if these objects have been completely separated from us. It is now as if all we're doing is passively noticing them. And we never take into account the fact that we've actually really constructed these things in our minds. Um, and that there's nothing at all there in the object that is a car. There's nothing in the object that is a table or is a microphone or is a cup. They might perform a certain function, but there isn't anything there from its own side, independent of its causes and its conditions and its parts and this active mental imputation. There isn't anything from the side of the object itself that is able to broadcast some sort of inherent identity, some sort of inherent self-supporting essence or nature. And that's all the Buddha is saying, is that things lack that kind of existence. They don't exist in that way. And that's really all the Buddha says about it. He doesn't, this is what's called a non-affirming negation. Um, the world of appearance is the world of inherent existence where things seem to be set up from their own side. They seem divorced from our own minds. And the Buddha just says, no, that isn't true. What appears is the result of the coming together of causes and conditions, parts, and then the mind, individually or collectively through society, designating a label on that thing, whether that label is dog or cat or flower or lamp or carpet, doesn't matter. We've labeled everything that we can, you know, blue, orange, pleasant, unpleasant. It's all a label that we are putting on the object. And the object itself doesn't exist in that way. And so this is particularly important because this process of thinking that appearances are separate from are not actively created is something that we are applying to our own ego identity. We don't only apprehend inanimate or animate objects out in the world, we apprehend our own ego identity. And we think in the same way that we think that tables and chairs and everything outside of ourselves is set up from the side of the table, of the chair. We think that our ego identity is also just self-sufficient, self-supporting, inherently existent, just kind of there. Um, and that we're not involved. And it's just sort of like, yeah, oh yeah, I am me. I am really me. There's a real kind of findable essence to my identity, just like we reflexively think that there's a real findable, pointable essence to tables and chairs and dogs and cats and whatnot. But the problem is that when you actually look for findable essence, when you actually investigate these objects that appear to the mind, you do find causes and conditions, you do find parts, you do find this dependent arising, but you don't find a findable, pointable essence that is the same as the label or the same as the appearance of that dependent arising. Um, but we're not good at understanding this, intuitively, or easily. And so we give a lot of power to the things that we think and the things that we feel. And we think that when someone insults us, we think they really insulted something findable, that insult struck something inside of us that's like, how dare they say that to me? How dare they call me that? Because we're clinging to this tight, kind of, solid I, idea of ourselves. Whereas we have the option of thinking of ourselves in this very loose way that the Buddha is presenting as, yes, there's causes and conditions. Yes, there are parts. Yes, there's this dependent arising, but there isn't this findable true essence, that is the same as the appearance to the mind. And when we hold ourselves in this really light way that the Buddha is saying, then we overcome all of the faults, all of the problems that come with holding ourselves in that really tight, solid, constricted way, where, you know, everything that happens to us, to me, is so critically important. And I have to get what I want. I have to pursue what makes me happy, what makes me comfortable, because there's this true, real me that is findable, that genuinely exists from its own side. Once we get rid of that misunderstanding, which we've layered on top of the causes and the conditions and the parts through this act of mental imputation, it's this act of mental imputation that gives that sense of solidity to causes and conditions and to parts. And once we see through that, then we've unlocked ultimately what will lead to our enlightenment. So I know that was a lot all at once. Any thoughts or questions? Yep.
Um, I just wanted to make sure I got everything under the conductive factors for proper diet.
Mhm.
I got that you said vegetarian, have a bigger meal for breakfast, have a lighter dinner meal. Did I miss anything?
No, I mean, yeah, it's about kind of moderation and wanting to wake up, kind of not sort of processing a lot of heavy food. Yeah, I mean, I would say generally avoiding like heavily processed food. When I say vegetarian, I kind of also mean like whole foods, foods that your body will actually recognize as food, I think is probably also really good. So um, that's not in the teachings because they didn't have processed food back then. Um, so that's kind of, I think, implied is sort of whole foods.
Okay. I really enjoyed the class. Thank you, Venerable.
I do have one quick
Mhm.
question that comes back to karma and sentient beings. And I have a question, just kind of what is and isn't a sentient being in terms of like insects, lizards, frogs, fish,
Mhm.
plant.
So the way that the Buddha, I'm sorry, well, the way that His Holiness, who is understood to be a Buddha, but the way that His Holiness the Dalai Lama explained how we can distinguish what there is or isn't a sentient being is whether the sentient being or whether the being, the object that we're investigating, whether it has volitional movement. Um, so if you observe the whatever it is for a period of time, and if it moves during that time, and if that mo- movement can't always be described as being due to a change in the environment, meaning that it just decided to, go somewhere. It just decided to go from point A to point B at some point, um, rather than it was carried there or the wind moved or um, something changed in the water, like, it just sort of diffused because of a gradient of some salt or something, and it just sort of, you know, so basically, most living things are sentient beings.
Mhm.
Uh, it goes down, certainly down to mosquitoes and fruit flies. Those are certainly sentient beings, even though they're very, very simple organisms. Um, Worms, certainly. When you get down to like viruses, bacteria, then probably they're not sentient beings. But anything that's kind of, you know, more complex than that, that can fly or that can walk or kind of move through water, that has volitional movement. Um, so so plants are not, plants can grow plants, but they only grow in response to sunlight. um, so all of their movement is completely dependent on the presence of sunlight. So it's not volitional movement. They're not just deciding one day to get bigger. They can't do that. um, and so the other way, the implication of a sentient being is that it is a mind possessor, that which we talked about. So plants can't be a host for consciousness, but any sentient being is a host for consciousness. So even a mosquito, even a fruit fly, they have a mind. They are a host to consciousness. but no plant is a host to consciousness.
Okay. Okay. And is there any are there any negative karmic repercussions for harming plants and flora?
Um, not. It kind of depends. When you get to the bodhisattva vows, then there are aspects of the bodhisattva vows where environmental, like larger scale environmental destruction is prohibited. Um, but we do also need to think about um, the animals that are living and do depend on ecosystems. So things like poisoning, the environment and things like that, where we are, you know, but really have to be intentional. We can't, um, you know, we could think, oh, well, I have a 401k and my 401k might be investing in a company that might be polluting. And we could really go crazy trying to like think of all of the ways. So really it's about personal, like we individually should think about our impact in the natural world. Um, but if it's like, one flower, one tree, or picking a piece of fruit, then that's really fine. But if it gets to the point where we think I'm disrupting an ecosystem, or I might be,
Mm-hmm.
causing sentient beings to not have a place to live or to be
Yeah.
harmed, then that's really something to think about.
Okay. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Anything else? All right. Well, so next month is the class where we focus on meditation for those for um the three, because there's a retreat on the 20th and the 19th, 20th and 21st, so we skipped that. So there are 3 Fridays next month where the focus is on the kinds of things that it would be helpful for a person to know if they were interested in starting a meditation practice at home. That's the focus of next month. Um, and then we skip May completely. And then June is introduction to mindfulness meditation with Venerable Katie in June. All right.
You
Are there any?
said that, sorry,
Mhm. No. Yeah.
you said that in June they were gonna start up discovering Buddhism.
Um. It. I'm still trying to find people. Um, it could get pushed to July. It could well get pushed to July. I'm having trouble finding people, but um, it's starting, but I can't say when it's starting.
Soon. Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, I had fun, so I appreciate giving me an opportunity to think about these topics. Uh, Enjoyed it.